Welcome to all the participants. We see that we now have some participants in the webinar, so very welcome to this IAU and International Higher Education webinar series on this time, the future of internationalization in short, medium and long-term perspectives. Good morning to all, or good afternoon, or good evening. I'm really very pleased to welcome you all to this third and very timely webinar. It is the end of an initial IAU series that we developed to react actually and respond also to the many challenges that higher education institutions around the world face in the face of COVID-19. So I'm thrilled to co-organize, we are thrilled to co-organize this series, the International Association of Universities, together with Boston College and the Center for International Higher Education, but in particular also with Hans de Wit. On the IAU side, I want to stress the important work done by Giorgio Marinoni, the IAU Manager Internationalization, and by a dear friend and colleague of the IAU based in Moscow, Ekaterina Minaiva. We're very pleased to welcome speakers based in Brittany, France. I thought you were in Paris, Eva, but you're in Brittany. A colleague who's now based in Abu Dhabi and a colleague based in Tsukuba. So we are international already, since we span quite a large region of the world. The interesting part here will be to focus in specifically on internationalization, the topic that many universities around the world are questioning themselves about. Where is it heading? Some people argued, is it dead? Are we going to be able to sustain the kind of internationalization that we've been promoting over time? And so it will be very good to hear from the speakers about your views. And just a little bit of information as well. So this series of webinars stops with this webinar.
Hilge, you are unmuted now. You're muted now.
Oh, I don't know who did that. Okay, am I muted again?
No, you're fine.
Okay. So I'm very pleased to also say and announce that even if this first mini-series on the future of higher education ends with this webinar today, we already have a new series in the planning, together with the Center for International Higher Education, but as well with CHEA and with the Council of Europe, and with colleagues from around the world on different topics. Next in line will be a webinar on the presentation of the outcomes of the IAU Global Survey on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. Then we will have 2 webinars on academic freedom and university autonomy, and that is planned for June. And then as of September, we're developing a new series of webinars around a variety of topics, also with Hans de Wit and the Boston College. So we're very pleased to welcome you here and to discuss the very important topic of internationalization of higher education, a future that we have to secure together so that we continue to work at the international and global levels as we did in the past, but maybe better into the future. I give the floor to you, Hans.
Thank you, Hilge, and welcome everybody to this webinar from my side and from the Center for International Higher Education. It's a pleasure to collaborate on these webinars with the International Association of Universities. And before I start, some remarks. Please stay muted, and if you are not one of the presenters, also don't include your video so that we can have not a large view of videos and disturb. So only the 3 presenters, Eva Egon Polak, Marta Losada and Saburo Oaki, and Giorgio Marinoni and me will be on the video screen. The rest, please mute your video screen, and then it will be possible to have a good connection. Internationalization of higher education, of course, is not an isolated topic. It fits into the broader context of higher education in the global arena, but has been a very important part of the way universities had to respond and individual students and governments had to respond to COVID-19. Many international students were had to move home or had to stay in the country but couldn't participate on campus and on site in classes. And it demonstrated the whole impact that international student mobility in particular had on internationalization, on higher education in general. It also forced us to look into much more online education in a very global context, with both faculty and students participating online from all kinds of different parts of the world. So it has both a mobility of an internationalization abroad context and an at-home context, in the sense that it made me much more necessary to look into what does it mean at home to work on in an international context. Collaborative online international learning became a natural part, although with a lot of trial and error and a lot of challenges, both for students, for faculty, and for institutions, how to deal with that. So in that sense, the topic of today is a very important one, and we have three excellent presenters to address that to us. And the idea is that they present approximately each 10 minutes. And after that, I will ask some questions to them. And then we will have time for Q&A based from the participants to this webinar. And we have already close to 150 participants and still others coming in, because I think over 500 people even registered to this webinar, and we will record it as well and available to you after that. So if you have questions, put them into the chat room, and then we will moderate that and make a selection of the key questions to ask in the time that we have available for the webinar, to ask feedback from our panelists. And Hilge and Giorgio, I think Giorgio in particular will moderate that part of the discussion together with me. We start with Eva Egon-Polak, very well known by all of you, not only for her role in the past as Secretary General of International Association of Universities and current Senior Fellow of International Association of Universities, but also for her contributions in the discourse and publications on internationalization of higher education. And she will start off before, and I will briefly introduce them when they speak, our two other presenters. So Eva, the floor is yours. When unmuted. You are still muted.
Please?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for unmuting me, and thank you for inviting me, Hans, Hilge, and Giorgio, to take part in this webinar. And thank you to all the participants from so many countries who decided to join us. There are many webinars scheduled every day, so we appreciate your presence today. So, can I have the first slide, please? Or the second slide, thank you. Let me start by saying that the future holds few certainties, and I find that it's always very risky to predict or try to predict the future. I don't think any of us could have imagined the kind of life we're leading now during the pandemic. The impact of this crisis is really unprecedented in its scope, in the sense that it is truly global. And every day we have to learn how to deal with it in our daily life, but also in our professional life. So my comments have to be taken as very personal rather than a scientific future scenario building kind of exercise. I'm both optimistic and pessimistic about the future. I think some of my comments will sound aspirational and wishful, but I think there are also some realistic and fearful comments that I need to make. The only thing we know is that we don't know what the future will hold. And we need time to see what the long-term impact will be. Also, I would like to stress, and all of you are in different parts of the world, and you will appreciate this, I'm sure, that there will be several possible futures, and they might be very different depending on where we are. Higher education institutions are not all starting in the same place, and the impact of COVID is also not the same. So similarly with internationalization, it may not have the same shape in the future. Can I have the next slide, please? I think the pandemic exposed both the very positive things in higher education and some less so. I think the word ugly is perhaps too strong, but I couldn't find another one. So I think I just wanted to say that we've seen both positive and negative realities come through. First of all, I think the lockdown and the closures were taken very quickly and very well orchestrated around the world. But too often, students were left stranded, some of them international students far away from home. Some were forced to leave their university residences very quickly without resources. And of course, they had a very uncertain future, as did the domestic students. The shift to online education, as Hans has mentioned, was quick, but not always easy. Access to and readiness for online education isn't the same everywhere, and not the same for all learners, both locally and internationally. So there is a real potential for increasing inequalities and growing gaps. I think the pandemic showed a very unhealthy dependence on the revenue from international students and their fees. We all knew that this was the case, but I think the pandemic really made it an unavoidable truth. And finally, we also learned that online academic and administrative collaboration was not just feasible, but can be very productive, including these webinars. So is going back to business as usual possible? I think it's unlikely, at least for a long time. But also we hear voices that it's also undesirable. The kind of internationalization we've seen develop has been inequitable, ecologically unsustainable, and the business model on which it is based is often not viable. So there's a real enthusiasm, especially in the scholars of international education, for a much needed change. And I believe that some of the statements and calls that have been made, especially by IAU, but not just by IAU, to focus less on the economic rationales for internationalization and focus more on the cultural and academic rationales, those statements will be read with a new or heard with a new resonance. The same thing about calls for far more social responsibility and the focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. That also will become a much more stronger call. Next slide, please. So among the possible futures, one of them might be going back to the basics. We've seen that technology shows a great deal of potential. Virtual learning is an indispensable tool, but that only holds part of the future. Maybe we'll need to look at internationalization in the recent past and find its future there. If I look more than half a century ago, 60, 70 years ago, 50 years ago, international education was not as much about the mobility for revenue. It was not a race for a share of the market. It was not about winning the best brains. It was about exploring and understanding other perspectives, learning languages, gaining cultural know-how, intercultural sensitivity, and it was a way to try and avoid conflict. International cooperation and capacity building were much higher priority than they are these days. Next slide, please. So one of the possible futures is to see a much more balanced emphasis in international education, might refocus more on content, on the curriculum, and invent new and reinforce certain modalities that do open up learning to other cultures, but without relying on mass physical mobility. Maybe for governments and decision makers, particularly rather than relying on provision elsewhere, will become a higher priority, both for the institutions and for governments. We may see a resurgence of taking and developing offshore programs and campus, a very rapid one. This actually may speed up. We will definitely, I think, see blended learning, both for domestic and international students, take on a much higher priority. And maybe the long-term mobility will become a norm once again, rather than something that we've seen developing as well. Hopefully, instead of competing for market share, we will see research cooperation to overcome the gaps in cognitive learning when we use online as a major means of educational delivery. Maybe that part will become a stronger part of our collaboration. We may see much more sharing of expertise about how to create an international environment for students and staff without mass mobility. Next slide, please. One thing that is also for certain, and that is that international perspectives and understanding will be more needed than ever before. I think the pandemic brought to light a number of critical issues that were visible, but not as visible as they are now. The huge socioeconomic disparities, both within countries and between countries, became very clear. And we know that limited access to higher education exacerbates these gaps and disparities even more. It revealed important cultural differences between peoples and nations based on different value systems. The right to privacy is different from country to country. The collective versus the individual right to freedom has been shown to be quite different between different nations. And these differences in cultural sensitivities have had their impact on the crisis management. The pandemic also shined a new light on differences in political and economic regimes versus democracy versus authoritarianism, the welfare state, or hyper-capitalist regimes where the economic well-being predominated the discourse and the priorities. We also saw the limits of economic and political globalization. Multilateral agencies and even regional institutions came under threat, and even bilateral relations were not at the best level when facing the pandemic. And all of these critical issues will need to be addressed by higher education in international cooperation, in research, in education, and in outreach. So I think the future of internationalization is as necessary as it has always been. Next slide, please. But I think we will see internationalization as we know it put to the test. We've argued that it is no longer marginal, that it is at the center of everything we do. But I think when it will be facing many other demands on higher education institutions in times of smaller budgets, I think it will be tested whether this is true and whether internationalization really is at the center of what we do. The integration and embeddedness of these international and intercultural considerations into the mainstream will face strong competition on the leaders' agenda, especially when the economic rationale for internationalization is so uncertain. If the revenues from international students are not present, will this field be as important to higher education leaders? So I think we will need to recast our strategies for internationalization and recast them in ways that they will meet the demands of society, which will be in economic and social crisis, as we have perhaps not seen for a long time. And I think our advocacy for international cooperation, for curricular change, for continued faculty and staff training will be needed, because there will be a strong push for much more local, perhaps less open, more nationally focused futures in many parts of the world. Next slide. The pandemic invites our humility, self-awareness, and selflessness. I think this crisis did demonstrate how vulnerable we are, despite the advances of science and technology, but also how resourceful humanity is. We saw the faith in scientific research and even in collaboration in scientific research regain the trust and faith of society. But at the same time, we became much more conscious of some of the dark sides of our interconnectivity, our cooperation, and the way we network around the globe in pursuit of internationalization. We have had a huge ecological footprint. And I think this crisis has shown that some of it may have been unnecessary. We're learning that much can be done without hopping on a plane, that social media can be extremely useful to mobilize goodwill, generate new ideas, and facilitate the sharing of learning. And we are also recognizing how unprepared we are to help some of the most vulnerable people in our societies, the elderly, but also in some cases our students, who found themselves, as I said earlier, without means of support, some of them very far away from home. Last slide, please. So let me start by saying the future will not be the same. My personal conviction is that the future of higher education and its international dimension will have to be anchored much more strongly in its social responsibilities. We've seen experts draw a link between this viral epidemic and this unsustainable manner in which we exploit our natural resources. So higher education and research efforts to address sustainable development will need to be reinforced and will need to continue. But they will also require deep appreciation and understanding of the international dimension of all these issues. The global nature of the pandemic makes collaboration essential, but also shows how cultural differences can make it more difficult. Around the world, I think we're living a real-time, massive global experiment in many, many regards. And the successful outcome is mobilizing scientists in all disciplines. And I think I need to stress here that it is requiring all disciplines to deal with this crisis in the proper manner, not just the health sciences, not only those who can bring answers in a health way, but also the social scientists and people in humanities that can help us respond better. International collaboration and mutual learning for students and faculty must be sustained in new ways, and we will have to rely less on face-to-face meetings. But at the same time, and international education is a witness to this, personal encounters create ties of friendship on which partnerships are based. And these personal encounters are indispensable, and hopefully they'll be possible again soon, maybe less frequently. But I think maybe because they will be less frequent, we will cherish them more, and we will make sure that they are as productive as possible. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eva, for this introductory overview and addressing both the pessimistic and the optimistic sides of the future of internationalization post-COVID-19. also not only looking at the mobility side, but also the home side, but also in particular at the role of science and research in the current situation as a very important part of the internationalization of higher education. Following up very much on what you have been writing already before in an ACA blog you wrote, and maybe we can put up some reference to that if people want to read that more. I can already announce that I will have more or less around the similar times a blog coming on the University World News about the end or revival of internationalization of higher education next weekend. So very important discussion. Keep on asking questions. I already saw that several people are putting questions in the chat list, so that's fine for the further discussion. But we go now on to our second panel presentation by Marta Losada, who brings in a very broad perspective from Latin America, from Abu Dhabi, from United States. So really a comparative perspective on the international dimensions of higher education, and we're looking very much forward, Marta, to your presentation. So please go ahead. Unmuting yourself is important. Who can do that? Because you're still muted. Yeah, now it is. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Hans and Giorgio, Hilij. I'm very happy to be on this panel. I also would like to say that Eva touched on many points that I will also make, but we did very independent work. So anyway, that's very interesting to see. I want to start the next slide, please, by discussing two main drivers of internationalization. And the first one is the student experience. So I would like to frame that a little bit. And the way I want to frame it is considering what have been the traditional mechanisms through which we've, enhanced the student experience in internationalization. And it's been through, of course, mobility, both for full programs or for study abroad, as well as the internationalization at home. A lot of curricular development for this, but also increasing in the percentages of international faculty and students in institutions around the world. However, let's consider this with the background of very current and important issues in higher education. We're still facing a big issue in terms of inclusion, of the widespread need for knowledge and competencies and skills for the youth. But actually, if you look at it nowadays in contemporary manner, you'll see it's really a lifelong experience. And more we see the recognition of what are the benefits of higher education. Still, we are very far behind in many regions in the world as far as inclusion. The second aspect is the increase the diversity of students, and this diversity along many different dimensions. Of course, the ethnical and racial, but also the social, the migrants, the rural, age, as I mentioned before, and even the academic readiness. So this wide group of people with such a dispersed kind of entry points have non-homogeneous needs and challenges that are faced. And how is higher education going to be responding to those needs and to actually be even more relevant as we move along? And the third issue is really that we've been competing to attract global talent, both students and faculty, and that has been a pervasive for many years now. And it has some very good aspects associated with this, but how will this be transformed given the current circumstances and what has happened with COVID-19? Next slide, please. So I also want to kind of give a little bit of a sense of some issues that are related to this student experience in and post COVID-19. As far as the teaching and learning components, the future of learning, will it be really more and more dominated by some versions of online learning? In my perspective is that there's going to be given this big population of young people that still are not included in higher education, that still require access, you'll be able to find, that there will be different ways that will have more resonance with different types of students. It may be possible that even more and more micro-credentialing will occur, given perhaps the needs that people are going to have to solve at the same time. And, they can't just solely be studying. They might have to be also solving economic issues, given the situation of recession. But let's consider what has been the changes in the interactions by having to go to this framework of remote learning. Something that's extremely valuable when you are in the teaching and learning environment, the interactions between students and the interactions between teachers and students. How are we really going to find, encouraging solutions to that? What are the new ways we're going to be able to collaborate and engage in different modes, using different technologies? I also think it's very clear that there's some types of student work that is very hard to transform. Lab work, studios, mainly the experiential learning becomes very, very difficult in the remote learning scenario. So of course, one may think that there may be some disciplines that are more suited than others, and that will be a fact for some time. For how long? Maybe I don't have the right answer for that yet. But it can also be transformed with technology, and it wouldn't surprise me that there will be strong drivers for transforming that as well. I think that one of the challenges has been maybe a reduced way of performing assessments in this framework during this pandemic. And this is something that has a lot of potential to develop, to become something more dynamic in many ways, and to be very creative in how our assessments are going to be of student learning. Because we have to keep in mind that our main purpose is of achieving learning outcomes in the students. This is absolutely crucial in any way that we change, that we continue to be able to obtain those learning outcomes. And at the same time, I think that higher education institutions need to anticipate and prepare for new education and work landscape post-COVID-19. For sure, there's going to be much more information technology and digitalization across all areas of knowledge. For sure, every person will have more enhanced digital skills, and there will be much more automation going on in our lives. So our curricula will also have to reflect that in significant ways. At the same time, we'll have to have even more enhanced health systems, and there's a much more environmental awareness, as Eva was pointing out before. And I will just say that this, again, will be permeating our development of our curricula in important ways. The economic transformations that we still don't know, we really can't predict for how long, how hard it's going to be for some countries. It's going to be very, very different across the global scale, I think. At the same time, I think that it's going to, once again, probably motivate the development of some kinds of new types of work and new kinds of needs of knowledge that have to be created. On the other hand, I want to give a very positive framing of this, in the sense that I have seen in my personal experience through this pandemic, the roles and the relevance of all disciplines, all the sciences, life sciences, natural science, social science, engineering, humanities, arts, culture. I've been really, really very, very positively impressed by the reaction and the contributions coming from so many different disciplines. And how it becomes something that comes to be very close to each of the individuals, and they all feel they need to find ways to contribute to thinking about this hard, thinking about this in ways that make each discipline extremely relevant. At the same time, it will maybe possibly generate new disciplines as a result of all of this effort, of all of the considerations and thought that's going into the disciplines that are currently active. Next slide, please. So what I want to finish with this first driver of internationalization is a kind of the takeaway point is that I think we need to ensure the student experience from the global education perspective. And for me, that means really something very basic. Continue to foster a global mindset. Continue to have students identify and solve global challenges and to promote global engagement. I think this is absolutely crucial to avoid the isolation, to avoid being limited in certain boundaries, to continue to maintain how relevant they are, to be really global citizens, and hopefully to be able to build new constructs from multiple perspectives. That could be a real positive outcome of the results of continuing a strong global education. Next slide, please. The next driver that I want to talk about a little bit is slightly different, which is the international partnerships. From the institutional point of view, all institutions are, have generated different types of partnerships. And these partnerships, of course, rely on trust, on having our interests aligned, of realizing which are the complementarities that exist in our strengths and our abilities. But very strongly, we have a common goal, and that's why we partner. And that goal in general, from the very high level perspective at the institutional level, is to be able to provide new meaningful opportunities for our academic communities. So I want to give just a few more details on this. And next slide, please. So from that very institutional perspective, and you can imagine you have a global strategy, you have policies and actions that are, the operational implementation of that global strategy. And for that, you're developing different types of partnerships. And these partnerships can be for many different purposes. They can be for research, for thematic networks, for cultural programming, for mobility, as we've been discussing. You also want to consider, according to your key priorities, when you're looking at your institution in a multidimensional way, which are the possible relevant networks and associations that you should be a part of. What is really the relevant issues that are going on in the international education agenda? How can I best help my own country in national representations and delegations in fostering collaborations between countries? And what is the global engagement that my institution has, and what is its visibility for the, everybody else outside of my own country? So these are typical actions that we implement. And so the question is, how will this pandemic change our strategy? Which elements of our strategy will change because of that pandemic and the new realities that we're facing? So next slide, please. And I want to give a key example of participation in associations. And the best one I can come up with is for this talk was the International Association of Universities. And the reason is because it really provides a unique opportunity to discuss challenges facing higher education at the global scale. It is an association where you can have an informed dialogue about issues of higher education and its role and its impact in society. At the same time, individually, for each one of us, we gain insight by interacting with our peers in a very enriching experience. So IAU has a real significant role to play. And when I was invited here by Hans and Giorgio, I of course said, yes, I'm really happy to be on this panel. I understand how you want to bring this to the, to the global scale. At the same time, IAU has specific programs, and these programs can be aligned with your key priorities. And so it's up to you to determine and to identify how those concrete programs can enhance your strategy and contribute to your global engagement. So I think it's a really interesting experience to actually rethink this. And more now than ever, I would say, in the context of this pandemic, at the IAU, you find this special forum at the global scale for these issues that are critical to all of our institutions. I'd like now to switch topic a little bit. Next slide, please. And just make a few considerations of the financial drivers of internationalization in higher education. So in the upper part of this slide, what I'm showing is just a few points of the international students. And the table is showing, you know, some financial and student data, which I'm not going to go into, but it kind of gives you the ballpark figures associated to that with some for those countries that I've illustrated right there. But if you look at the data there, you find that there are a large fraction of students in a given country come from very few other countries. So you may have in total many students coming from many different countries, but the fraction, the largest fraction is reduced to only a few countries. At the same time, if you look at the details of what are students studying, for example, in the US, it's mostly in STEM fields. In the UK, it's mostly associated in business. That's the largest fraction of students. You have, of course, differences. How many are really coming for undergraduate studies? How many are coming more for graduate studies? But one of the important points, and I think it was also related to what Eva was mentioning, is that you start to find countries where a significant fraction of the total students in a country are coming from abroad. On the other hand, the experience of student mobility for, say, a semester, a study abroad for a semester, etc., has a completely different scenario. And a typical example is your Erasmus program. And here you can see in the table roughly what was the expenditure and the number of students that were mobilized through the Erasmus Plus program in 2018. So this is just to give you an idea of the flux, of the size and the flux of students that's going on in the world, which is actually very interesting. But if you look at the overall proportion of students, well, it's still not so large. Next slide, please. So I want to come back to what are some constraints, some challenges, and some opportunities. And I'd like to frame that first. Oh, and one thing important before I go on there is that it's very important to consider the revenues that I was just showing in the last slide, because these revenues create a lot of jobs. They create a lot of jobs in these countries. And I think that that's also absolutely very important to keep in mind, that how the whole systems of higher education are strengthened because of that. So coming to the constraints and challenges and opportunities, I think that it's very important to recognize how during the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of capacity building in many countries around the world at national levels. There's been a larger middle class, and part of that larger middle class has allowed more international students. But at the same time, in the current framework of COVID-19, that may be a situation which the stronger the higher education system in a given country, it may be able to retain more students now. Families were very stressed during this period. They may be less disposed to think about, you know, students moving away. As I want to continue to say what I said at the beginning, there is a large fraction of students that have needs with respect to higher education. And I think there's still going to be a lot of possibilities. I don't think it's going to shut down very dramatically or very drastically, but I do think people are going to rethink what they're going to be doing. What are the decisions that they're going to be making? Another thing is that universities have increased very, very significantly their integration and relevance with their local communities and their local context. And of course, here in the pandemic, it was extremely important. It was very evident, the reliance on the local capacities of the universities all over the world in different countries. And that is, I think, going to increase quite significantly. It's going to even build a stronger case for the relevance of having stronger higher educational systems in your own country. On the other hand, we are facing possibly real significant changes in immigration policies. And that can, of course, very significantly affect the flow of students, of staff, of faculty. And what will be the consequences of internationalization of higher education because of these immigration policies? Recession, of course, with much fewer economic resources, There's going to be all kinds of implications for flow of students, but also for hiring. But on the other hand, that may be a limitation for some countries, while other countries may be able to retain more their, you know, the talent and the faculty level, and they may be able to have opportunities for hiring that they weren't competitive enough before, for example. At the same time, all institutions pivoted in a very interesting way to be able to provide students with an opportunity to continue with their studies. So they've developed new capacities. And will these new capacities then be able to allow them to generate new ways of permeating the global landscape? Will you be able to be less localized in your impact through those new capacities that you've developed? So some questions that I'm just going to leave you all with. Will new mechanisms, priorities, and goals of partnerships be developed? What will be the final impact on countries that have been receiving high revenues from international students? Will there really be or will it be just for a short-term period that you'll see this effect? Or will it drastically change what we have been seeing and has been a trend for many, many years? And the new opportunities after gaining the online remote learning experience, what are the new opportunities there that can be generated for all institutions, for societies to respond to societal needs from the perspective of the universities? And again, even though many countries were already considering that they needed to diversify the number of students that were coming from international students that were coming, this in part was allowed because of the stronger middle class. Will that diversification of countries continue? Or will we be seeing much less of that? And my main message is I think that we need to maintain the connections. We need to maintain our ways of interacting. We need to maintain our dialogues for the benefit of everyone at the global scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta, for your comprehensive overview of issues related to that. The student experience in the first place, which I think is very important, certainly in this time. Then the importance of partnerships, international partnerships, is an important dimension of internationalization to strengthen and to maintain, but in particular also to strengthen the role of IAU in that. But also looking at one of the aspects which is very important, but also now under a lot of chances, the financial drivers for internationalization and what does it mean for the future. Thank you very much. We also given time. We go now on to our last panelist, Saburo Aoki, who is Dean of Faculties of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Tsukuba in Japan, and will give us his perspective from his experience with internationalization as a dean and from a Japanese perspective. The floor is all yours, Saburo.
So thank you very much for inviting me in this webinar. My name is Saburo Aoki. Aoki is my family name and Saburo is my first name. Saburo means third, and ro, son, third son. Aoki, Ao means blue, and the ki means tree. So my name means third son of a blue tree. And I'm the dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of one of the Japanese university in Japan. And so my talk is very small and brief. The title is Internationalization of Higher Education in Japan. So the next slide, please. So just one slide. So I would like to talk about the past and today, present day, and the near future of internationalization in the context of East Asian and Japanese context. So I'd like to start by, first of all, by defining what I mean by internationalization, because the concept of internationalization is specific according to history, according to country, according to universities, and so on. So in the case of Eastern Asian countries in general, and Japan in particular, internationalization is nothing more than modernization and westernization or Europeanization. So in the 19th century, for about 40 years, so university professors were invited from England, the United States, France, and Germany, and so on. Teaching was done in German, French, and English language according to the disciplines. The government, I mean the Japanese government, sent the Japanese elite to the United States and so the countries, European countries. And this movement of modernization in 19th century was considered as internationalization for us. In other words, internationalization is the opening, the country, the project of establishment, foundation of a unified nation, of participation in the international community. Bref, in short, internationalization is nothing other than nationalization. So during 100 years, 1 century, internationalization was perceived by culture, academic exchange through research project of scientific promotion and so on, led by dynamic people who have international relations, people who have international friends, colleagues, with former international students who have important places in universities, in important social institutions, and so on. So personally, I could develop some international project with my colleagues, international colleagues of long time, during more than 10 years from 1990, sorry. So for instance, I developed Euro-Japan Academic Network with European colleagues from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and so China, Korea, and Taiwan. One another project, Central Asian Japan Network in the field of human and social sciences, with my colleagues from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, Vietnamese, Japanese teachers. And the third one is a Trans-Pacific Network with Central American and Latin American countries, in particular Chile and Brazil. And the Francophone Network with University of Grenoble, Bordeaux, Franche-Comté, Paris, and so on. And ARENA means Alliance for Research on the Mediterranean and North Africa with colleagues of Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt. That I could develop for more than almost 20 years. So we are now in the phase of strategic change. So to stimulate the mobility of international students, to offer universal teachings, to share knowledge about the universe, the earth, life, and man, to respect biodiversity and the cultural diversity. All these things are in the program of the internationalization of higher education. So we need a strategy in the institutionalization of educational organizations. So at present, the reforms are done with speed and energy. For instance, the reform of structure of management of the universities and the reform of administration and the reform of curricula, I mean degree programs and so on, and the strengthening of the faculty, so capacity of teachers, and researchers, and the promotion of a scientific research project, and so on. So we need a strategy, and this is the present day, the situation. But it's a constant challenge with the difficulty. It is not so easy. It needs a lot of time, money, and dialogues, and actions. That's also the reality. But I see, so during these strategic internationalization, I see two important points. First, the problem of language as a communication tool. It is the easiest and the most cost-effective way to use only English language throughout the education and research space. But we must not neglect more than 100 years experiences that the people have accumulated to build the society system, political, social, economic, scientific, cultural, and traditional system by the national language, for us, for me, by the Japanese language. So the conflict and the dilemma between two systems developed in English way and the traditional way are very important reality. The second point is the problem of cultural identity. I would say that the brain of people is socialized, colorful, with culture and collective memory. For most people, English is a language that circulated in the university space and in economic and scientific society, but not in every life for us. It will therefore be necessary to balance the share of teaching and research with the international language, I mean English, and the share of teaching and research in the traditional, in the country, with the local, regional, national language. The problem is extremely complex. But in Europe, for instance, the EU adopts plurilingualism. The case of the countries of Central Asia is also particularly interesting for me. Personally, I happen to teach the science of language in Tashkent a few years ago, and it's amazing to have 2 classes in 2 different languages, in Uzbek and in Russian language. But the students were the same in both classes. So we cannot decide what percentage of international education and national traditional education would be the best for the internationalization of higher education. Personally, for my faculty, as dean, I said it is a very good thing to introduce 30% of internationalization of the Japanese university. But quantitative analysis cannot make a decision. Do we want a hurried, snap reform, or extreme radicalist reform, or moderate, realistic reform? The reform to the return to tradition until or ultra-nationalist or xenophobe, and so on. So we must decide for making a decision. So the quantitative analysis is not sufficient. Today, we have to discuss the future of higher education in this seminar, but which was marked by the crisis in the world situation, in particularly COVID-19. The actual pandemic has taught us many, many things. We are surprised by the similarity of the situation described by Alessandro Manzoni, The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, or Daniel Defoe, A Journal of Plague, Plague Year 1722, The Plague of Albert Camus, and so on. In people's behavior, this is at least fear, anxiety of existence. But at present, despite of fear and anguish, there is also goodwill and courage to overcome this difficulty by strengthening the international network. So the pandemic gave a very important impact to the widespread use of webinars. This made it possible to generalize the forms of education without spatial and time constraints. Internationalization comes now at the time of real transborder thought. Now, the knowledge circulation and the information are done on web, Zoom, like now, or Teams, and so on. So, but at the same time, it is a very important moment to reflect on the content that cannot be transmitted via web, Zoom, Teams, and like that. So this kind of means. Internationalization is now going through a new phase, new figure. I agree with the idea of Eva and Marta. Despite the uncertainty, despite the lack of definition of a new internationalization, and especially thanks to this situation, it is a good opportunity to introduce new disciplines, flexible method, compatible with the social transformation of human behavior after COVID-19. So my talk is finished. So the discussion is opened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I will ask one question, but also given time, I will also only ask maybe Eva to start, and if the other two want to follow up, we can do that, but keep your answers as short as possible. And then I go on to Giorgio Marinoni, who will then moderate the questions that come from the floor, and we have seen several questions on that. My main question is following even the last word of Saburo Aki, and what has been part of also Marta's presentation and yours, Eva, is there is a sense still of opportunity and optimism. And I am wondering if you can elaborate on that, because if we look at the past, already at the late of 1990s, we had a reaction to this focus on mobility, either credit mobility in Europe, which reacted in the internationalization at home movement, in Australia and UK as reaction or revenue generation, the internationalization of the curriculum. We had the movement of comprehensive internationalization in the United States. And still the drive was very much more on the competition, revenue generation than on those aspects of internationalization. 20 years later, not much has changed. Even when Uwe Brandenburg and I wrote our provocative essay on the end of internationalization, and IAU also started with a movement and action of rethinking internationalization, not much has changed. And then we are now in 2020. We see already before COVID-19, we saw anti-globalization, anti-immigration, a lot of nationalism and going on. And then the crisis above that makes it even much stronger as we see how presidents like Bolsonaro and Trump and others over on in Hungary, etc., are much more anti-international. Is it really possible to think that we can be optimistic about the future of internationalization of higher education in this context? Does that go as easy as it could be given these circumstances when we were not successful in the past? So that's my a little bit provocative question. which I would be interested to hear something about.
Well, can you hear me? Have you unmuted me? Yes, thank you. I think it's a very, very tough question. I thought that, in fact, my thoughts about the future have been slightly more pessimistic than the many articles that I read, where people, experts around higher education institutions, really see the opportunity rather than the real challenges facing the future of higher education. So I thought I was being rather pessimistic. I think one thing is clear to me: necessity will require that things change. The necessity to adjust to fewer students. I believe there will be fewer mobile students, and yet I think there are enough scholars and faculty members and leaders committed to making certain that we have an open, more international, intercultural sector, will make sure that that will continue despite the fewer students. So we will be seeing, I think, a variety of initiatives to appropriately and better blend students who are not mobile with students who still wish to learn in an international context. I think so necessity will, I think, lead to us. I do feel concern with a number of countries where the regime is actually closing rather than opening. We can only hope that this is temporary. But I think it was Marta who said that immigration policies will also potentially reshape our world. I believe that we will see a reshaping of where mobility and collaboration patterns take place. Maybe it will be a much broader base. We have seen a great deal of concentration of where students come from and where students go. That may change. I think that students will be much more discerning of other aspects besides which university has the best reputation. They will be looking at the healthcare context. They will be looking at the security. They will be looking at the policies for immigration that are possible. So I'm optimistic because I think universities will learn and will devote much more effort to finding internationalization strategies that will withstand some of these huge challenges. The one that we haven't talked about a lot, and for me, it's going to be, I think, the most important one, is the economic crisis that will not just change international education, it will change higher education. I think there will be people who will suffer so much economically that higher education may not be an option anymore. So we have to see, you started, Hans, by saying internationalization is just one aspect. We have to see higher education in a holistic way and seeing international as part of that. But these institutions are resilient and very resourceful. So I have good hope.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I now give the floor to Giorgio to moderate the questions that came from the audience, because there are a lot of questions and we still have little time left. So be also there short in your answers. Thank you very much. Giorgio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed, as you said, we are having a lot of questions. So I will try to be brief, and I will start with a question from a student, because he's a PhD student that is introducing a topic which could be very interesting. The topic is this one. He's saying that he's a student and he has paid fee in a university in a country. It's not important to mention that he's charging fee for international students. And this university decided to move the course for next year online, but the fee remained the same. And he's saying the quality is not the same, the treatment I will receive is not the same, why should I pay the same fee? And this is probably a very interesting topic, and I think you would like to know some reflection from our speakers on this topic. Who wants to start?
Sorry.
Marta, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that there are various different points here. I think that a little bit in agreement with what Eva was ending, I think that this may cause possible shifts of where people will look for opportunities for their international experience, their international studies, because you will find other options very much available that the situation in terms of fees is completely different. So that can be something that can determine, you know, how people will make different decisions. At the same time, I really want to ask, what is the difference in the quality? What is really the difference in the quality? Because those are statements that are important, and we've actually gone through certain points in different, you know, in different frameworks around the world in different countries, and asked this question. And so it actually doesn't come so closely related to the general program learning outcomes. They could be pretty much the same, with some difficulties, as I mentioned before. But it might be because the interactive experience is different, because you're not, say, in some cases, living in the residential campus, for example, or if you're not accessing all the other perks that were there before. So, but is it really related to the academics? That's the big question. And I would say that I'm not completely sure about that. On the other hand, of course, there are reasons there are tuition and charge in many institutions around the world. Some countries, that's the framework in which the universities have to function. That is a reality. And so they have to charge tuition fees.
Thank you, Marta. Anybody else want to comment quickly, or can I move to another question?
I would only suggest that I slightly disagree with Marta on this, because I think that the experience is different. Going back to the issue of language, for example, taking classes online is just one part of your experience. When you go to study somewhere else, you develop a whole appreciation of the language of the place, for the culture of the place. I think it depends on what it is that the student seeks. If it is a degree, first and foremost, disregarding the experience of learning about another country, and then I think it's probably the quality could be the same. But if it's the whole experience, then I think there is a big difference. And in that respect, I think the purposes may differ. Just one comment I would make, the interesting part will be for those institutions that rely on the PhD students in the lab. What will they do when they do not come? Because that is the other side of the coin of international movements of students, especially at the PhD level.
If I may add briefly, and then Marta wants to support, I'm inclined to agree with Eva. There's a big difference between the levels as well. I think if you talk about graduate education, in particular master programs, then I don't think there's so much need of a difference. But at the undergraduate level, it is a huge difference if you get an online education or you get an on-site education. And there, I think the impact of on-site is so much more important because of the community that you develop and the social life around it and the interactions, etc., that there is a price tag related to that experience as well, and you have to take that into account.
So let me just clarify. I agree that there is a difference in the interactions and in the level. But if I look at the specific quality of the academics, it's a different point. I also think that it's something that will continue to improve, because there will be a driver for this, for sure. So maybe, of course, this last minute pivoting, of course, was not the best experience, but it doesn't mean that that will maintain in that way. I do agree, and I mentioned it in one of my slides, the interactions. How are we going to change? How would that change? And maybe that can be enriched in a very different way. I also think that as far as graduate students, it is a very, very complex issue. And it really needs a lot of thought. And it might be an opportunity for those countries that were losing too many students at the graduate level.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, which is a very interesting one. You might have a short reply. Somebody is asking, we are kind of living in an experimental phase and we are trying a lot of new technique of teaching and learning. Do you think this will just be a temporary phase, or we will learn something which will be integrated also in face-to-face teaching after the crisis? Saburo? Maybe Saburo, he has not replied yet. Saburo, please go ahead.
You're muted. Yeah.
Okay, Saburo.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is very, very important and very interesting. And I have no so concrete answer, but I'm thinking of it at the same time. And my solution is both. And so we are now the temporary situation. We are living in a temporary situation, but the harmonization of this kind of online system of education, online way of education, and so the face-to-face education. So both the harmonization is our task as teachers to realize, to introduce one new a new method of education. So that's the way we must go, and we must imagine and to invent something to efficacious and to interesting. I don't know, I explain very well myself, but because the online communication is no gravity, no also sensuality, no sensitive element, but contact, touch is very, very, very important. Eva said the cultural element, but the contact is a basic for the communication and the understanding deeply our world, and the not human, but the relationship between humans. So we need both sides of education. So I don't know how we can harmonize, introduce both sides in one curriculum for master course or bachelor course and so on. That's all I want to say.
Giorgio, if I could
Yes.
just add, I think
Sure.
one of the things that this experiment will allow is it's not only happening in universities. Our secondary school students are also experimenting, and the teachers are also experimenting with online education. So it's not just the teachers in universities that are learning how to, it's also other levels. And I think there is a big likelihood that some of that will remain. Some of that learning is not going to disappear. And I think we will continuously improve how we blend. I think Saburo was saying harmonizing, but I think it's also a blending of these two different modes. And I think, yes, some of it will stay.
Yeah, and if I may add, I think what we will see is that what already was happening, and in particular in the global south, much more than the global north, this movement to collaborative online international learning, that will get a big boost by this, because suddenly now people see, like we do in this webinar, we have people from all over the world, if you look at where people come from. So that people realize that it is possible also to have an intercultural communication going on online. So bringing that in, so not replacing. We always talk about either or, but it is both. And that's we have to stress much more. The combination of the two, that will be, I hope, the biggest advantage of this crisis in how we're going to teach in an international context.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I have other two questions that I would like to propose to you, and I will kind of combine them because they are related. And one is saying internationalization can have a lot of tools, positive tools, to develop international cooperation, but we are seeing at the present moment also another effect of a power struggle of soft power by countries. And you also mentioned it once before, and here I'm coming up also with the second question because it's kind of reaction to your intervention, that there are some regimes that are kind of having a close attitude. I also have a specific question coming from participants saying, what do you mean with close attitude from some governments in the case of Hungary, for instance? And on the other side, how the first question more generally is, how can you see this kind of competition between different governments in research, for instance, in research to find a vaccine for COVID-19, where we have seen there is not even cooperation, but there is a lot of competition. We even have cases here in France, for instance, of a pharmaceutical company saying, if we will discover the vaccine, we will sell it to the United States because they have financed our research and we will make money. So how the higher education community could go more towards the cooperation in internationalization and limit this kind of power struggle between different governments? That's the overall question. Marta?
Yeah, well, I just want to say, I think that one has to be a little bit careful in looking at what is very visible in the media to what is that interaction with other levels of government, and how different academic communities are also approaching this and keeping clear their needs, their preoccupations, their way of understanding how it's important to maintain this flux of people, the internationalization component, for their own reasons, of course, for their own interests, and that's fine. But they are maintaining open these dialogues, and it's extremely important to do so, to continue to make the case of why you value it, why it's important that the governments are doing. So I don't think we can still say, I mean, there's one very visible media kind of pronunciations, but there's another level in which you have to and you should continue to work in that advocacy for what you believe in. For if we really are focused on maintaining the very good components of what is the internationalization of higher education, we have to make sure that we are able to state the case clearly and be able to get results of doing that with our governments.
Yeah, at the same time, I mean, I absolutely agree, Matt. I think on the academic side, between institutions and between researchers, there's a lot of international cooperation going on. And that's very important. And they will try to work together in finding solutions, not only in the vaccines, but also in what the impact in the social sense is. But it's also true that governments like the Trump administration is putting a barrier on that by challenging them that they will be going to jail for doing that kind of cooperation, etc. So we have to be careful also to address that aspect of the dangers of blocking international cooperation by governments like the Trump administration. But I think it's much more indeed at the power political level than it is the academic level, absolutely.
But I also think we need to distinguish between applied research and fundamental research. I think there is a great deal of cooperation even now around potential research for the COVID vaccine in the fundamental research side rather than the applied. This is where I think the competition and the profit making comes in. As we have Mr. Trump moving one way, I think everyone knows that Monsieur Macron has recently stated that this kind of work on a vaccine should be in the public domain, in the public, seen as a public good. And here I would say we need to, in our advocacy, really strengthen multilateral organizations. I think it is the OMS that can push back. Now, without the US as a member, it doesn't matter. It is an organization like the OMS that needs to be strengthened to be able to advocate for those areas that are in the public domain or in the public good, so important. And I think this crisis has actually diminished our trust, at least in some respects, in those multilateral organizations. And that we have to be very careful about.
I have another question from a participant, which is bringing us to a more positive note. And I would like to you speakers to comment on this one, because it can also have a dark side. The question is, starting with a comment and saying that this crisis has also shown to society, to the community, the importance not only of research, but of knowledge and higher education as a whole. But the question is also saying, will this mean at the end that there will be a flux of resources, and especially financial resources, for research-intensive universities, and only for them? And so, on the positive side, the importance of higher education will increase, but at the same time, there is a risk of a growing gap and a risk of inequalities, because the resources will more for the research-intensive university. What do you think? Who wants to take it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that anything that really unbalances things is not positive. I mean, we obviously need to ensure the right resources, but they have to also not create more inequities. So this is really, really important to understand, and also to be able to state the case more frequently, and I'm a scientist, of the values of humanities, of arts, of culture, and it has to be restated more and more every day by every one of us. The scientists, the first ones that have to say it more and more, because it is extremely important.
I think the same could be said about funding for various disciplines in general. This may represent a resurgence in STEM disciplines for a while, re-establishing the prominence of those disciplines as opposed to social sciences and humanities. And again, the same answer as Marta's. I think it is really critical that we demonstrate and universities advocate for a balanced approach. I think one example is the deconfinement that all countries are slowly and surely going to experience. We need social scientists, we need psychologists, we need people who know the impact this confinement has had on society to be part of the discussion, of the political discussion about deconfinement. They've been left out in many parts. We've talked to doctors, we've talked to medical science and the medical community, but they alone cannot, in a sense, be in charge of the changes that are taking place. So I think it's a question of real balance. And it isn't just in research intensive versus not research intensive, but also within universities, which disciplines we really support equally.
Saburo, please go ahead.
So the problem is to know who are managing the balance between the study of applied science and so the basic science like humanities or basic physics and so on. And so who are the responsibility? That's the very important and very serious question. I'm dean, so I'm managing. So I'm always asked to gain the budget more than yesterday, more than so today. So I must make a proposal tomorrow. So better than, much better than today. So for also the research budget, and so for creating, so that so we must create so many so interesting project with maybe so the using military budget, why not, and so another thing, how to say, so industrialization of so our knowledge in the society and the human being is so required, but it is not our wish, our so purpose to do so, but so it is so necessary to do so for keeping budget, for paying students, and for paying teachers, and for paying everybody, and for guarding the reputation of our university, and so on. So we are now the context of concurrence. So higher education, so internationalization is one of the tools of this kind of indicators to evaluation for keeping budget. It is a very bad vision of internationalization, but we must recognize it. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Saburo. Thank you very much to all speakers and all participants. We'll still have questions, but unfortunately, we already ran out of time. But before leaving, I would like to give the floor back to Hans and Ilige for a short conclusion because also this is the last webinar in the series. So thank you very much, Ilige. The floor is yours.
Muted. You're muted, Ilige.
I'm trying to unmute her, but there is something doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Ilige, try to speak.
Yes.
All right. Okay, good.
Okay, I can try sign language, but I'm not sure that it's the same in every time part of the world. I want to thank the speakers because it was really very interesting to listen to you. Giorgio, you say this is the last webinar in this series, of this mini series, but I want to repeat, this is only the beginning of a longer conversation. We will have more, and I would like really to thank the three speakers for excellent presentations and for kicking off in our series. I know there are other webinars as well treating the topic, but for kicking off this discussion in this very nice way, because it is providing for many questionable issues, as you could see in the chat as well. We will try to gather all the questions that have been asked and to see where a next mini-series could go, because I think the topic of internationalization touches actually on all the very different aspects of what a higher education institution actually stands for and what it is looking at for its future. It is like all the participants will have probably the same sentiment as I have, the wish to continue the conversation because it's only just starting and there are all the other issues that are on the table. I just wanted to maybe allude to one thing that I found interesting as well at a conference that was hosted by Tsukuba University not so long ago, and where Prof. Pornchai Monkonvanet from Siam University and myself were convened to actually come and make a presentation. That conference was called Society 5.0, the transformation of the Japanese society. And we were very kindly invited to come and organize a session on the importance of the humanities for the future. And that was really fascinating. The room was packed, the people had many questions, and there was a real emphasis on the importance of social sciences, humanities, and how they integrate and interact with all the other disciplines. And that was a beautiful opportunity to actually put right on the table at an event, bringing together many stakeholders from society, the importance of this dialogue between disciplines, as Eva said, as Marta stressed, and as you, Sabura, also indicated, because this is the importance of the future as well. And one point to the international experience, I think that one point that I would like to also maybe highlight, because it came out of your presentations, and that's this importance of internationalization, offering the opportunity to actually bring our knowledge systems together, and also the importance of the mobility, but in a reasoned way. As you said, Eva, there are things that we have to rethink. Marta, you stressed that as well. But as Sabura also said, we need this extra experience of getting out of your comfort zone and have the opportunity to meet the other physically. You talked about touching, you talked about getting the things together. So I think these points are only part and parcel of the discussion that all the participants will certainly also have the opportunity to discuss again in a future mini-series of the IAU together with CIHE. So this is a very nice appetizer with a lot of content. Some will have dined with it and others will see this as a beginning of more. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you certainly also to all the participants, and let's take this to the next level. So the floor is yours, Hans.
Thank you, Hilge, and thank you, Eva, Marta, and Saburo for your presentations. And I think indeed a very interesting seminar, indeed an end of 3 seminars together, because as we always say, internationalization cannot be seen isolated from the broader happening in higher education in the world. And as something has become clear over the past months, that's absolutely the case. So we have to look forward. And we have not, I think that's my message from these discussions, we have not to take granted that the opportunities will develop. As I think Eva said, there's an absolute need to make changes and to move into the right direction, but it is not automatically going to happen. So for us who are believers for global engagement and global citizen development, we really have to make an effort for this in the future, even more given the difficult circumstances that we have. And let's keep discussing, let's keep having this international dialogue via webinars, and let's hope in the future also on site again, and that will take a lot of time. I just saw the notice that the European Association of International Education had to cancel its conference in Barcelona and postpone it for 1 year. And I think that will happen with many events. I only still hope that IAU will be able to come to Dublin in November, and that we can meet there, but that will also be a challenge. But we have to look forward to the future, that we will be able to meet each other again in person, but at the same time we have to continue this dialogue. And the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, together with IAU, will certainly be part of that by organizing new webinars, not only on COVID-19, because we also have to look at the more broader issues that we have been discussing here about research, collaboration, difference we haven't addressed so much between the global north and the global south in higher education and internationalization, and private higher education developments in the context of the new future. So we look very much forward to meeting you all in future webinars between IAU and CHC. And thank you all for your presentations and your great participation also with the audience into chatting and asking questions. Giorgio, you want to make a final comment or close the event?
No, I mean, I can just thank you very much, you, Hans, for the great collaboration between IAU and Boston College, and for coming up with this idea of this first series, as Hilge said, first series of webinars. It has been really appreciated. I would like also to thank Boston College for providing the Zoom platform of today. And I want to thank Katarina Minaiva from the Higher School of Economics for, you have not seen her, but she was in the background really helping us conducting not only this webinar, but all webinars. And thanks, of course, to all speakers, the 3 speakers of today's and also the speakers of the previous 3 webinars. Thank you for Hilige for the great moderation role. Thank you to all participants. I hope you will be following also the next webinars. And finally, last but not least, it has been said already, but all the webinars, the presentation and the registration of the webinars will be available on the IAU website and the IAU YouTube channel. So thanks to everybody once again. Have a nice morning, evening, or night, wherever you are in the world, and see you at the next IAU webinar. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.